At first, it didn't come from myths or explorers or half-burned journals hidden in museum basements. It came from machines, cold, unromantic, orbiting thousands of kilometers above the Earth. Satellites built to monitor deforestation, rainfall, and soil moisture began noticing something they were never programmed to look for. Beneath the unbroken green skin of the Amazon, shapes appeared where chaos should have been, straight lines where nature prefers curves, perfect angles where erosion should have erased intention. Vast geometric scars, too large to be accidents, too precise to be trees playing tricks on shadows. From space, the rainforest looks eternal, endless, alive in every direction. But when scientists began stripping away layers of vegetation digitally, using LiDAR, multispectral imaging, and radar that could see through dense canopy, the illusion cracked. What emerged were grids, roads, causeways stretching for kilometers, raised platforms arranged with mathematical intent, circular enclosures the size of stadiums, megastructures abandoned long enough to be swallowed, but not long enough to disappear completely. It was as if an entire civilization had been folded neatly under the forest, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right angle of light to reveal it. What unsettled researchers wasn't just the presence of these structures, it was their scale. These weren't isolated villages or ceremonial clearings. These were interconnected systems, spanning regions larger than some modern cities. Networks of earthworks linked by elevated roads designed to survive seasonal flooding. Carefully engineered landscapes that reshaped rivers, redirected water, and domesticated the jungle itself. The Amazon, long believed to be an untouched wilderness, suddenly began to resemble something else entirely. A constructed environment, maintained and managed by millions of people who vanished without leaving monuments of stone. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If structures this large existed, if civilizations this organized once thrived here, how did we miss them for so long? How did centuries of exploration, conquest, mapping, and science fail to notice what satellites casually uncovered in a few decades? The easy answer is vegetation. The jungle grows fast, aggressively, reclaiming everything. But that explanation feels insufficient when you consider the precision of what was hidden. Straight roads buried under roots, symmetrical enclosures disguised as hills, entire cities camouflaged, not by accident, but by time behaving a little too conveniently. Some of the anomalies were so regular that early analysts assumed software errors, false positives, noise. But when ground teams followed the coordinates, they found the shapes were real, earthworks cut with intent, soil layers arranged deliberately, charcoal signatures suggesting controlled burning on massive scales. This wasn't primitive slash-and-burn survival. This was landscape engineering. And it forced archaeologists to confront a radical revision of history. The Amazon may once have supported population densities rivaling medieval Europe. Yet, despite the growing evidence, these discoveries were strangely underplayed, announced quietly, published cautiously, often framed as isolated findings rather than pieces of a coherent whole. No grand narrative, no dramatic reimagining of civilization, almost as if the implications were too disruptive. Because if the Amazon was once home to advanced, populous societies capable of megastructural planning, then the story we've told ourselves, that civilization only flourished in temperate zones, that jungles are barriers to complexity, collapses entirely. Satellite imagery also revealed something more troubling. Many of these structures align with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles. The roads don't just connect settlements, they point somewhere. The enclosures aren't random. They mirror patterns seen in distant cultures across the world. Similar geometry, similar spatial logic. As if these societies were not isolated experiments, but part of a broader, shared understanding of space, time, and environment. And that makes the idea of simple disappearance harder to accept. Civilizations don't just vanish cleanly. They leave debris, layers, stories. But here, it's as if erasure was prioritized. Organic materials decay, stone is scarce, and what remains is Earth itself, designed to dissolve back into nature. No towering ruins to attract attention, no obvious monuments to conquer or preserve, just infrastructure that could quietly disappear under leaves, roots, and rain. hidden not by secrecy, but by compatibility with the environment. Some researchers have begun to ask an unsettling question. What if these structures weren't merely abandoned, but intentionally concealed? What if the people who built them understood something about long-time scales, about collapse, about the dangers of being visible? The Amazon is one of the few places on Earth capable of completely erasing large-scale human activity, if given enough time. And perhaps that was the point. Build in a way that allows disappearance. Design cities that can retreat into myth. Satellite data also shows something else: patterns of avoidance. Modern settlements, roads, and even deforestation often curve around these buried sites without knowing why. Construction projects stall. Flooding becomes unpredictable. Soil behaves strangely. It's as if the land itself resists disturbance in these areas, preserving what lies beneath through subtle instability. Almost like a passive defense system written into the terrain. And then there's the timing. Many of these megastructures date to periods just before known societal collapses. Climate shifts, disease, sudden population declines, moments when visibility might have meant annihilation. If hostile forces arrived, human or environmental, disappearing into the forest could have been survival, not defeat, a strategic withdrawal from history itself. Satellites don't see intention. They only see shape, shadow, and anomaly. But when anomaly repeats itself across thousands of kilometers, when it forms networks instead of noise, coincidence becomes an increasingly fragile explanation. The lost city of Z, long dismissed as an explorer's obsession or hallucination, begins to look less like fantasy and more like a misinterpreted truth. Not a single city, but an entire hidden world. Not lost, but layered. And perhaps the most disturbing thought is this: we didn't find these structures because we were looking for them. We found them accidentally while watching the forest die. As trees fell, the past emerged, as if the jungle, stripped of its protective cover, was reluctantly revealing what it had been guarding. Not out of generosity, but out of exhaustion. If satellites can see what human eyes never could, then what else lies beneath the assumptions we've built our history on? What other civilizations are folded into landscapes we call empty? And what does it mean that the Amazon chose to hide this one so well, for so long, until only machines could see it? Because once you accept that megastructures existed here, vast, deliberate, coordinated, you're forced to confront a darker possibility, that some knowledge was meant to be forgotten, that some civilizations didn't fail, but chose obscurity over conquest, and that the forest didn't just grow over them by accident. It was allowed to. Percy Fawcett did not write like a man chasing fantasy. His journals read like controlled pressure, like someone carefully rationing disbelief. Page after page, he documented rivers, insects, tribes, measurements, compass bearings. And then, buried between the logistics, something slips through. Descriptions that don't fit the vocabulary of known architecture. Shapes he struggled to name. Angles that felt wrong. Structures that appeared designed for minds that did not think the way humans think. Fawcett repeatedly noted stoneworks that felt out of scale with their surroundings. Not in size alone, but in intention. Walls that curved subtly inward, not collapsing, not eroded, but shaped that way from the beginning. Platforms whose proportions felt mathematically precise yet emotionally unsettling, as if their geometry obeyed rules unfamiliar to European logic. He wrote that some ruins gave him the distinct impression of being constructed to be seen from above, an absurd notion in an era before satellites, airplanes, or aerial mapping. And yet, the feeling persisted strongly enough that he recorded it more than once. What unsettled Fawcett most was not age, but style. These were not variations of known indigenous structures. They did not resemble Incan masonry, Mayan pyramids, or any Amazonian tribal constructions documented at the time. He described surfaces too smooth to be accidental, yet lacking the tool marks expected from chisels or metal implements. Stone blocks that fit together without mortar, but also without the familiar stepped joints seen in Andean sites. He struggled to explain how they were made, because the techniques implied either lost technology or a completely different approach to material manipulation. In one entry, Fawcett mentions a ruin that seemed to resist categorization entirely. Not quite a building, not quite a road. A raised formation with embedded stone nodes placed at intervals too regular to be decorative. He wrote that standing within it produced an odd sense of disorientation, as if perspective itself bent slightly. Sounds behaved strangely. Echoes returned delayed, warped. He dismissed none of this as superstition, yet he hesitated to commit to explanation. Instead, he used a phrase that appears several times in his private notes: non-human in character. That phrase has been quietly ignored for over a century. Fawcett was not prone to mystical language. When he used those words, he was not suggesting extraterrestrials in the modern sense. He was describing a feeling of otherness so complete that it broke his existing mental frameworks. Architecture, at its core, is frozen cognition. It reveals how a mind understands space, movement, hierarchy, and function. What Fawcett encountered felt like it came from a cognition parallel to ours, not superior or inferior, just fundamentally different. He described entrances that did not announce themselves as entrances, thresholds that lacked symbolic markers, structures that appeared to guide movement subtly, funneling bodies along paths without obvious walls or barriers, as if the builders understood human behavior deeply enough to manipulate it through environment alone. This disturbed him. He wrote that these places felt active, not abandoned, not alive, but attentive. In another journal passage, he mentions carvings that were not pictorial, no animals, no gods, no recognizable mythic figures. Instead, repeating abstract motifs that changed depending on the angle of light. Patterns that appeared simple head-on, but revealed layered complexity when viewed peripherally. He compared them to mathematical functions rather than art, visual logic rather than storytelling. That absence of narrative iconography was, to him, deeply abnormal. Every known culture encoded meaning in symbols. These builders, whoever they were, seemed uninterested in being understood. Fawcett also noted something even stranger. Some structures appeared partially organic, stone interwoven with what looked like fossilized root systems, yet arranged too deliberately to be natural. He speculated that the builders may have grown their architecture rather than assembled it, encouraged stone and vegetation to merge over time, producing structures that blurred the boundary between construction and environment. This idea, radical even today, was impossible to articulate seriously in his era, so he wrote it cautiously, almost apologetically. And then there is the recurring theme of scale mismatch. Doorways too narrow for European bodies but too tall for known Amazonian tribes, seating like depressions that did not fit human posture, chambers whose acoustics amplified frequencies uncomfortable to the human ear. Fawcett never concluded that these were built by something other than humans, but he repeatedly questioned whether they were built for humans as we understand ourselves now. His tone shifts noticeably when writing about these sites. The confident explorer becomes restrained, even anxious. He warns future readers not to underestimate what lies hidden. He suggests that the jungle may be deliberately protecting something, not through myth, but through difficulty, distance, disease, disorientation, as if access itself were meant to be filtered. After his disappearance, these passages were conveniently sidelined. Editors emphasized adventure, bravery, obsession. The more unsettling architectural descriptions were framed as stress-induced exaggeration, fever dreams, or romantic speculation. Yet, when compared with modern satellite data and LiDAR scans, some of Fawcett's sketches align eerily well with structures uncovered a century later. He was not hallucinating shapes. He was seeing fragments through the limitations of ground-level perspective. What Fawcett lacked was altitude, context, the aerial view that reveals intent. When he wrote of patterns too large to comprehend, he was standing inside them. Perhaps the most haunting line in his journals is not dramatic at all. He writes, almost casually, that certain ruins gave him the impression of being unfinished, not because they were abandoned mid-construction, but because their function required observers who no longer existed. Architecture waiting for minds that never returned. Infrastructure built for a way of life that withdrew itself from history. If the lost city of Zay was not a single destination, but a network of such places, then Fawcett may have been brushing against the edges of something intentionally subtle. A civilization that did not announce itself through monuments, but through spatial intelligence. One that understood that permanence invites destruction, while obscurity invites survival. And if that civilization existed, then the most dangerous assumption we've made is that disappearance equals failure. Fawcett may have realized too late that some societies don't collapse. They decouple. They step sideways out of visibility, leaving behind architecture that looks wrong to us because it was never meant to be read by our kind of mind. The jungle did not drive him mad. It showed him something he did not have the language to safely describe. They didn't warn explorers with threats of violence or displays of force. They warned them with certainty. Indigenous tribes across the Amazon spoke of guardians that could not be seen, entities that did not hunt, did not chase, did not announce themselves. They simply enforced boundaries. Step where you were not meant to step, and something would shift. Not always death. Sometimes confusion. Sometimes illness. Sometimes a feeling so heavy that the body refused to move forward. The tribe spoke of these things calmly, as facts, the same way one might warn a child about a deep river or unstable ground. Early explorers recorded these warnings with mild amusement. Invisible guardians sounded like folklore, a convenient myth to keep outsiders away from sacred land. But what unsettled some of them was how consistent the stories were across tribes separated by hundreds of kilometers, languages, and cultures. Different names, same function. Different myths, same outcome. Certain areas were not to be entered, not because of spirits in the religious sense, but because something was still there, watching, maintaining balance. The tribes never described the guardians as gods. That distinction matters. Gods demand worship. These did not. They were described more like systems, forces, presences bound to the land itself. The warnings were practical, not theological. Hunters spoke of sudden disorientation when crossing invisible lines, paths that seemed to loop endlessly, sounds that mimicked familiar voices, drawing people away from camps, animals behaving erratically near certain regions, refusing to enter clearings no matter how desperate the need for food. Some tribes claimed the guardians were not separate beings at all, but extensions of the land's memory, the forest remembering what was built into it long ago. The idea was simple and terrifying. The ground itself had rules, and those rules were still active. To violate them was to trigger a response, not out of malice, but necessity, like touching an exposed wire and blaming the electricity. Explorers who ignored these warnings often met strange ends. Expeditions vanished without signs of conflict, camps abandoned mid-use, food untouched, equipment neatly arranged as if departure had been sudden but orderly. Survivors reported overwhelming dread with no identifiable cause, sudden fevers that appeared and disappeared just as inexplicably, compasses spinning uselessly, maps becoming meaningless as landmarks seemed to rearrange themselves. What's disturbing is how rarely these incidents involved obvious violence. No ambushes, no massacres, just removal, as if the forest rejected intrusion the way a body rejects a foreign organ. Quietly, efficiently. Anthropologists later noted that many tribes viewed these guardians not as protectors of people, but of places. Sacred zones where ancient agreements had been made. Agreements not just between humans and spirits, but between humans and structures, humans and systems older than any living tribe. Some elders spoke of ancestors who were instructed to leave certain cities behind, to let them sleep. The guardians were not created to punish outsiders, but to ensure no one stayed too long. There is a recurring phrase translated from several languages that roughly means those who remain when we leave. Not ancestors, not animals, something else. Something tasked with continuity, maintenance, watching over things that were never meant to return to prominence. One chilling account describes a tribe guiding missionaries along a river, stopping abruptly at an invisible boundary. They refused to cross, not out of fear, but respect. They said beyond that point, the land listens. Words spoken there do not fade. Thoughts echo. To build, to cut, to mark the ground would be remembered. And remembrance, in that place, had consequences. Modern researchers dismiss these accounts as psychological suggestion, fear conditioning, environmental stress. But satellite data shows something curious. Many of the regions described as guarded align precisely with the buried megastructures detected from above. The same zones explorers were warned away from are the zones modern technology struggles to penetrate cleanly. Signal interference, unstable readings, unexpected errors, as if the land still resists being fully observed. What if the guardians were never meant to be seen because they aren't entities at all? What if they are protocols, environmental defenses embedded into the landscape itself, engineered ecosystems designed to confuse, deter, and filter intrusion? The tribes may not have understood the mechanics, but they understood the outcome. Cross the line, and you are no longer welcome. Some elders spoke of a time when the forest was taught how to hide things, when paths were trained to disappear, when water was guided to flood certain routes seasonally, when plants were cultivated not just for food, but for concealment. The guardians, in this telling, are not supernatural beings, but a living system handed down, maintained through ritual and knowledge long after its original creators vanished. And yet, even that explanation feels incomplete, because the fear described by outsiders doesn't feel learned. It feels imposed, sudden, physiological, as if something in the environment triggers the nervous system directly, a deep primal signal that says, leave. If the lost city of Z was deliberately hidden, then guardians make sense. Not warriors, not walls, but invisibility enforced through environment, psychology, and time. A defense that doesn't announce itself, because announcement invites challenge. The most effective barrier is the one you don't recognize until you've already turned back. The tribes didn't say the guardians would kill you. They said you wouldn't belong anymore. And perhaps that is the most terrifying warning of all. From the ground that they look like nothing, scattered stones, low ridges, slight rises in the earth that feel accidental beneath your feet. You could walk across them 100 times and never realize you were standing inside a message. That was the genius of it. The stone formations only resolve into meaning when seen from above, when distance replaces immersion, when perspective itself becomes the decoding key. Pilots flying over remote stretches of the Amazon in the early 20th century occasionally reported strange alignments beneath breaks in the canopy. Lines that seemed too straight, circles too precise, shapes that vanished the moment clouds shifted or altitude changed. These reports were dismissed as pareidolia, the mind imposing order on randomness. But decades later, satellites confirmed something unsettling. The shapes were real, and they were deliberate. Vast geoglyphs carved into the earth, some stretching hundreds of meters across, arranged with geometric rigor that defied coincidence. Perfect circles connected by straight avenues, squares nested inside rings, zigzag patterns that repeated across regions separated by rivers and terrain, not drawn with stones stacked high like monuments, but etched shallowly, subtly, as if meant to persist without announcing themselves. Earthworks that survive not by defying nature, but by blending into it. What makes these formations disturbing is not just their scale, but their orientation. Many align with cardinal directions to a degree of accuracy that rivals modern surveying. Others correspond to solstice sunrises, equinox shadows, lunar standstills. Some appear to map river systems abstractly, not as they flow on the surface, but as they behave underground. Patterns that suggest knowledge of hydrology, invisible to the naked eye. From the sky, these shapes don't look decorative. They look informational, like diagrams, like circuitry, like something halfway between architecture and language. And language, by definition, implies an audience. But who was meant to read it? Certainly not the builders themselves, who lived entirely within the pattern. Certainly not neighboring tribes who lacked the vantage point to see the whole. The only way to fully comprehend these formations is from above, from a perspective unavailable until very recently. That alone should trouble us, because it suggests either an impossible foresight or a patience measured in centuries, even millennia. Some researchers argue these formations were ceremonial, symbolic expressions of cosmology. Others believe they were territorial markers, visible to gods or ancestors watching from the sky. But there's a deeper strangeness here. The formations are not random expressions of belief. They follow rules. Ratios repeat. Distances scale predictably. Certain shapes recur with minor variations, as if iterated over time, refined like versions of a design. That's not how myth behaves. That's how systems behave. In some regions, the stone arrangements form sequences. A circle leads to a line. The line terminates at a square. The square opens into a spiral. Seen individually, each shape feels ambiguous. Seen together, they suggest progression, movement, a path not meant for bodies, but for interpretation. Almost like instructions frozen into the land. What's even more unsettling is that many of these formations sit directly above the buried megastructures detected by satellites and LiDAR, roads, platforms, ancient settlements now hidden under jungle. The stone codes appear to mark them, not with obvious signals, but with patterns only visible from a detached, elevated viewpoint, as if the surface message was designed to remain dormant until rediscovered by something capable of seeing the whole. Modern analysts have attempted to interpret these shapes mathematically. Some sequences resemble astronomical cycles. Others map onto geometric progressions used in advanced engineering. A few eerily resemble logic gates or flowcharts when abstracted. No single interpretation fits everything, but the consistency across vast distances suggests shared intent. And then there's the question of erosion. If these formations were truly ancient, rainfall should have erased them. Vegetation should have destroyed their clarity, and yet many remain detectable after thousands of years, not because they resisted erosion, but because they anticipated it. Shallow trenches that fill predictably, stone placements that guide water flow instead of fighting it, designs that degrade gracefully, remaining legible even as they soften, like messages written knowing they would be read through distortion. Some archaeologists have quietly suggested that these codes were never meant to be permanent. They were meant to fade, to become unreadable once their purpose expired. The fact that we are only now rediscovering them may mean we are late, or worse, early. Because what kind of civilization encodes information into the landscape itself, hides it from ground-level awareness, and designs it to be legible only from a technological perspective that wouldn't exist for millennia? One that either expected to return or expected someone else to arrive. There's a haunting pattern reported by satellite analysts. When these formations are digitally overlaid across the basin, they form larger meta-patterns. Clusters align. Networks emerge. The Amazon stops looking like a random sprawl of hidden sites and starts looking like a single integrated canvas, a continent-scale composition. Too large for any one city. Too coordinated for isolated cultures. Almost like the forest was the medium. The codes don't spell words. They don't depict stories. They don't announce identity. Instead, they encode relationships, position, orientation, connection, the kind of information you would need if you were navigating not just space, but time, or if you were trying to preserve knowledge without trusting memory, language, or continuity of culture. And maybe that's the point. Stone formations don't lie. They don't reinterpret themselves. They don't mutate with oral tradition. They sit, waiting for the right perspective. The builders may have known that everything else would vanish. Their people, their language, their cities. So they wrote into the only thing that could outlast disappearance, the land itself. Seen from the ground, the Amazon hides its past perfectly. Seen from the sky, it begins to speak. And the most unsettling possibility is that we're only seeing fragments. That the full message requires a perspective we still don't have. Because if the lost city of Z was hidden on purpose, then these stone codes aren't art. They're placeholders. Markers left behind by a civilization that understood something about vanishing without being erased. There is a particular kind of disappearance that unsettles investigators more than death ever could. Not when bodies are found. Not when wreckage surfaces. But when something simply stops being present, without resistance, without signal, without aftermath. The Amazon has perfected this kind of disappearance, and some expeditions didn't just vanish before the age of technology, they vanished with it. Modern teams entered the forest armed with GPS satellites overhead, radios calibrated to military standards, emergency beacons designed to scream their location through canopy, cloud, and storm. These were not romantic adventurers with journals and compasses. These were scientists, surveyors, and documentary crews with redundancies layered upon redundancies, and still, there are cases where all of it went silent at once. The pattern is what disturbs people who study these events. Not failure over time, not gradual loss of contact, but simultaneous collapse. GPS trackers freeze on coordinates that later prove inaccurate. Radios transmit static, then nothing. Emergency beacons fail to trigger. Satellites record the last known positions. Then, no movement. No distress calls. No evidence of panic. Just absence. Search teams often describe an eerie normalcy at the last known camps, tents intact, food prepared or half consumed, equipment neatly arranged, no signs of struggle, no blood, no trails leading away. It's as if the people stepped out of the scene and were never recorded again, not lost, not taken, simply removed from continuity. In some cases, GPS data reveals something even stranger. Tracks that loop impossibly, straight paths that suddenly double back without explanation, coordinates that drift slowly while teams insist they are stationary, devices reporting altitude changes where none exist. These anomalies are often blamed on canopy interference or magnetic irregularities, but that explanation collapses when every system fails in concert, across different frequencies and redundancies. Radio operators listening in on lost expeditions sometimes report brief transmissions that don't fit standard failure patterns. Voices distorted but calm, words out of order, requests that don't align with the situation. Phrases like, "We're still here," or "The path is wrong," spoken without urgency, followed by silence. Not a cry for help, a statement of confusion. What haunts investigators most is what doesn't happen afterward. No debris washes downstream. No remains surface months later. No equipment turns up in villages or black markets. Even in cases where bodies would be expected to decompose and scatter, nothing emerges. The forest absorbs everything, including evidence. Some researchers have begun quietly questioning whether these disappearances are spatial rather than fatal. Not deaths, but displacements. As if the people crossed into zones where conventional tracking no longer applies. Places where signal propagation behaves differently, where time, orientation, and continuity lose their reliability. This sounds like fantasy until you examine the data clusters. Many vanishings occur near the same regions flagged by satellite anomalies, near buried megastructures, near zones indigenous tribes warned outsiders not to enter. The overlap is uncomfortable, too consistent to ignore. There are also reports of search teams experiencing momentary signal loss themselves, even while standing in open clearings. Radios cutting out, then returning. GPS units recalibrating unexpectedly. A feeling of being briefly unregistered, as one operator described it. Present, but not accounted for. In a few classified cases, military-grade equipment failed in ways engineers could not replicate in controlled environments. Systems designed to operate independently interfered with each other as if responding to an external condition rather than internal malfunction. No electromagnetic storm, no solar flare, no mechanical explanation sufficient to cover the scope of failure. And then there is the silence from above. Satellites don't always lose track of these expeditions. Sometimes they continue to see them, heat signatures that remain stationary longer than human survival would allow, shapes that appear on infrared imaging, then fade without movement, as if whatever was there ceased emitting recognizable biological patterns. Not dead, just not readable. This is where the idea of guardians, systems, or environmental protocols becomes difficult to dismiss. If the land itself was engineered, shaped deliberately to conceal, filter, and discourage intrusion, then interference with modern technology would not be accidental. It would be a feature, a passive defense that doesn't attack, but denies persistence. Disappearances without trace are the cleanest form of protection. No retaliation, no escalation, no story to chase. Just a warning written in absence. What's most chilling is how quickly these cases are closed. Labeled accidents, equipment failure, environmental hazard. The files don't linger. There's no appetite for deeper inquiry, because deeper inquiry forces a question modern civilization is uncomfortable asking. What if some places are not meant to be accessed indefinitely? Not sacred in a spiritual sense, restricted in a functional one, like systems left running long after their creators are gone. Systems that don't recognize intent, only conditions. Cross the threshold, and continuity is no longer guaranteed. If the lost city of Z was deliberately hidden, then disappearance becomes part of the architecture, not as punishment, but as enforcement. The forest doesn't chase you away. It simply stops acknowledging that you were ever there, and perhaps that is why no trace is found. Because from the perspective of whatever still governs those spaces, nothing went missing at all. They are not displayed openly, not placed where outsiders can photograph them casually. The ritual masks are brought out only during specific ceremonies, at specific times, and only for those considered ready to see them. Elders describe them not as representations, but as reminders, not art, not symbolism, memory given shape. The masks depict beings that do not match human proportions. Elongated skulls tapering backward unnaturally, faces narrow, almost stretched, with eyes placed too high, too wide, too still, mouths small, expressionless, sometimes absent altogether. No fangs, no monstrous exaggeration. The terror doesn't come from aggression, it comes from restraint, from intelligence implied without emotion. Tribes say these beings were not spirits in the sense outsiders imagine. They were rulers, not kings, not gods, custodians of spaces beneath the earth. Underground halls where sound behaved differently, where light was unnecessary, where walls themselves were said to listen. The masks were not worn to imitate them, but to acknowledge authority, to signal compliance. What's unsettling is the consistency. Across tribes separated by distance and language, the masks share core features. The same elongated cranial shape, the same absence of decorative excess, the same emphasis on verticality, as if height mattered more than width, as if these beings were adapted not for open land, but for corridors, chambers, subterranean architecture. Some masks are carved from wood so old it resists dating, others from stone that does not match local geology. A few incorporate materials that should not survive humidity, yet have. Fibers treated in ways modern conservators still don't fully understand. When asked how they were made, elders often say they were not made by the tribe, but inherited, passed down from a time when contact was direct. The stories tied to these masks are not heroic. There are no battles, no revolts, no divine punishment. The relationship described is administrative, structured. The beings ruled underground spaces while humans lived above. Interaction was limited, regulated. Certain people were permitted to descend. Most were not. The masks were used to mark those boundaries during rituals, to remind the community of agreements older than memory. One recurring detail appears again and again. The beings did not walk like humans, not quadrupedal, not serpentine, but with a stillness that unnerved witnesses. They were said to glide slightly, as if gravity affected them differently. Not floating, not flying, just unburdened. The masks exaggerate this by elongating the neck and skull, drawing the eye upward, away from the body, away from human grounding. When anthropologists documented these artifacts, they labeled them ancestor spirits or symbolic representations of wisdom. But that explanation collapses under scrutiny. Ancestor masks typically emphasize familiarity, lineage, emotional connection. These masks do the opposite. They emphasize distance, otherness, authority without kinship. They are deliberately unsettling. Some tribes say the underground halls still exist, not collapsed, not sealed, simply inaccessible. Entrances that shift, openings that appear only under certain conditions, not magical ones, environmental ones, sound, vibration, silence. The beings depicted in the masks were said to maintain these halls long after humans were told to leave, ruling not people, but spaces. And then there is the detail most outsiders ignore. The masks are rarely looked at directly. During rituals, they are angled, tilted, seen in peripheral vision, never stared at head-on for long. Elders warn that direct prolonged viewing is disrespectful or dangerous, as if recognition itself carries weight. Some masks show markings that resemble geometric patterns seen in the satellite-detected stone codes, lines intersecting at odd angles, repeating motifs that do not resolve into images. When overlaid digitally, researchers have noted uncomfortable similarities, as if the same visual language was used both above ground and below. Architecture encoded into art echoing infrastructure. If the lost city of Z was not just a surface settlement, but a layered civilization, then underground halls make sense. Climate control, storage, retreat, and rulers adapted to those spaces would not resemble surface dwellers. Elongation is efficient underground. Narrowness conserves space. Reduced facial expression suits low light. The masks may not be exaggerations. They may be accurate. The most disturbing interpretation is not that these beings were monsters, or gods, or aliens. It's that they were administrators of a hidden system, non-human not because they weren't biological, but because their role was inhuman. Governance without empathy. Continuity without attachment. The masks are not warnings of invasion. They are reminders of hierarchy, and the tribes keep them not out of fear, but obligation. Because agreements, once made, do not expire just because one side forgets. If underground halls still exist, if systems still operate, then authority may still be acknowledged, even if the rulers are no longer visible. The masks are brought out sparingly for a reason. They are not meant to summon. They are meant to remember who was never meant to rule the surface, and who chose to stay below when the world above became unstable. The weather changes before the land does. That's what unsettles researchers most. Not storms appearing out of nowhere, not dramatic lightning or impossible hurricanes, but subtle deviations that only become obvious when patterns are compared over time. Rain that should fall evenly instead curves. Clouds that should drift straight begin to bend. Wind that follows predictable corridors hesitates, splits, and reforms as if encountering resistance. Meteorologists studying the Amazon noticed it first as statistical noise, small inconsistencies around certain regions, rainfall slightly lower than expected here, slightly higher there, humidity behaving oddly at the edges of otherwise stable systems. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarms, but persistent enough to refuse correction. When these anomalies were mapped, they traced shapes, not random blotches, but outlines, rings, corridors, zones. And those zones aligned uncomfortably well with suspected lost city of Z sites. Around these areas, storms weaken or divert. Thunderheads lose cohesion. Lightning frequency drops. It's not that weather doesn't occur there, it's that it behaves differently, less chaotic, more controlled, as if the atmosphere itself is being gently guided away, discouraged from lingering too long. Pilots flying over these regions report unexpected turbulence transitions, sudden calm pockets inside otherwise unstable air, instruments disagreeing with visual conditions, clouds thinning unnaturally fast as if pulled apart. Again, nothing violent, just refusal. The sky choosing not to fully commit. Satellite climate models struggle here. Predictive algorithms consistently miscalculate precipitation and wind flow in these zones. The models correct themselves everywhere else, but around these sites, they drift, as if the underlying assumptions no longer apply, as if something on the ground is altering boundary conditions in ways the equations don't expect. Some researchers suggest dense vegetation or unusual topography, but that explanation weakens when you realize these anomalies persist even where the canopy has been cleared. Even where deforestation should normalize airflow and solar heating, the deviations remain. The forest changes. The pattern doesn't. Local tribes have always known this. They describe these places as areas where the sky listens to the ground, where rain hesitates because it is not needed, where storms pass respectfully, as if aware they are not welcome. They don't call it weather control. They call it balance, maintained long ago, still functioning. There are stories of sudden downpours stopping abruptly at invisible boundaries, of fog that rolls in thick, then thins exactly at the edge of sacred land, of oppressive heat lifting without breeze, leaving behind an unnatural stillness that feels watched rather than empty. These accounts were dismissed as folklore, until weather stations began recording the same thing. One particularly unsettling observation involves temperature gradients. Infrared satellite data shows subtle cooling over suspected sites during peak heat hours, not enough to feel cold, enough to reduce convection, enough to suppress storm formation. Almost like thermal management, passive, persistent, invisible. If you were designing a system to keep an area concealed, weather would be an elegant tool. Not walls, not force, just discouragement. Make flying uncomfortable. Make mapping inconsistent. Make prolonged observation difficult. Let clouds blur detail. Let rain wash away tracks selectively. Let humidity corrode equipment faster than expected. No dramatic defense. Just friction. What's chilling is how old this pattern appears to be. Tree ring analysis suggests rainfall irregularities in these zones going back centuries. long before modern climate disruption, long before satellites. Whatever is shaping these microclimates predates industrial interference. It is not reacting to us, it is continuing. Some scientists quietly question whether large-scale earthworks beneath the soil could be influencing groundwater flow and heat exchange, raised platforms, buried channels, stone formations interacting with moisture and temperature in complex ways. If the lost city of Z was not just built on the land but into it, then atmospheric effects would be inevitable. Architecture doesn't end at walls, it reshapes ecosystems. But that explanation still feels incomplete. Because the precision is too clean, too consistent. Natural systems tend toward mess. These deviations maintain form. The most disturbing theory is not supernatural, but intentional. That ancient builders understood climate well enough to design landscapes that self-regulate weather. Not to dominate it, but to stabilize it. To reduce extremes. To preserve conditions favorable to concealment. A city that survives by never attracting attention from the sky. If true, then the weather anomalies are not malfunctions. They are features. And they raise a final, uncomfortable question. If these systems are still influencing clouds, rain, and wind after centuries of abandonment, then what else is still operating beneath the forest? What other layers of design have we mistaken for wilderness? The Amazon does not behave like untouched nature everywhere. In some places, it behaves like infrastructure, quiet, patient, and very good at hiding what it was built to protect. The discovery didn't begin with bones laid neatly in tombs or mummified remains sealed away from decay. It began with fragments, teeth pulled from riverbanks, bone slivers dredged from soil layers disturbed by floods, traces so degraded that for decades they were considered useless, too contaminated, too incomplete. And then genetic sequencing improved, and suddenly even ghosts could speak. When scientists began analyzing ancient DNA samples from deep Amazonian contexts, they expected variation within known indigenous lineages, migration patterns, bottlenecks, adaptations to rainforest life. What they didn't expect was divergence, genetic markers that didn't comfortably sit anywhere on the human family tree, not modern contamination, not lab error. Repeated signals appearing independently across sites, separated by vast distances. These samples didn't point to a new species. That would have been easier to explain. Instead, they suggested a lineage that branched off early, remained isolated for an impossibly long time, and then vanished. A population that contributed almost nothing to modern genomes, as if it withdrew without mixing. No gradual absorption, no clear extinction signature, just absence. Some markers resemble those found in ancient Australasian populations. Others echo Denisovan fragments discovered thousands of kilometers away. But the combinations don't match any known migration model. The Amazon was supposed to be a genetic endpoint, populated relatively late by humans moving southward. These samples challenge that entirely. They suggest either an earlier arrival or a parallel population that shouldn't have been there at all. What disturbs geneticists is not just age, but stability. These lineages show signs of long-term continuity without the genetic drift expected in small, isolated groups. That implies population size, structure, organization. Not a handful of wanderers, but a sustained civilization capable of maintaining genetic coherence over centuries. And yet, when researchers look for descendants, the trail ends. No living tribe carries these markers in significant amounts, not diluted, not recessive. It's as if the lineage didn't fade, it stopped. Cleanly, deliberately. A genetic silence that doesn't behave like natural extinction. Diseases leave scars. Conquests leave admixture. Famines leave demographic echoes. This leaves nothing. One unsettling hypothesis has begun circulating quietly in academic circles. What if this lineage practiced intentional genetic isolation? Not just cultural separation, but reproductive boundaries enforced so strictly that mixing was minimized or forbidden. That alone would be unusual, but combined with sudden disappearance, it suggests planning, withdrawal at the biological level. Some of the DNA samples come from regions associated with the buried megastructures detected by satellite and LiDAR. The overlap is hard to ignore. These were not random inhabitants of the forest. They lived where architecture once reshaped the land, where underground halls are rumored to exist, where tribes speak of rulers who were not quite human. And then there are the physiological implications hinted at by the genetics. Certain genes associated with cranial development, sensory processing, and circadian rhythm appear slightly altered, not mutated in a pathological sense, tuned, as if adapted to environments with low light, confined space, or altered acoustics. Environments like subterranean chambers. This is where speculation becomes unavoidable, not extraterrestrial speculation, evolutionary speculation. What happens when a population adapts not to open savanna or forest canopy, but to enclosed engineered spaces over long periods? Bodies change, perception changes, social structures change. Over generations, you get divergence without monstrosity, difference without myth. The ritual masks depicting elongated beings suddenly feel less metaphorical. What's chilling is how carefully these findings are framed in public discourse. Terms like unknown population, ghost lineage, statistical outlier, nothing that invites imagination, nothing that connects dots. Because once you do, the story stops being about migration and starts being about intentional disappearance. If the lost city of Z was hidden on purpose, then genetics would be the final thing you'd want to leave behind. Bones decay, buildings crumble, stories mutate, but DNA persists, unless you ensure it doesn't, unless you leave quietly, unless you take your lineage with you. There is a final detail rarely mentioned outside specialist circles. Some of these ancient DNA samples show signs of deliberate burial conditions designed to accelerate degradation, soil chemistry altered, microbial activity encouraged, as if someone understood, long before modern science, how to erase biological traces over time. That is not the behavior of a civilization caught off guard. That is the behavior of one executing a plan. The unknown lineage doesn't scream conquest or catastrophe. It whispers coordination, a people who didn't want to be found, not just culturally, not just architecturally, but biologically. And if that's true, then the lost city of Z wasn't simply hidden by jungle and time. It was hidden by choice, at every level: stone, weather, signal, memory, even blood. Which leaves us with a deeply unsettling possibility, that what we call an unknown ancient lineage is not lost at all. It didn't die out. It stepped away from the surface world, leaving behind just enough evidence to confuse us, but never enough to fully remember them. Because some civilizations don't collapse. They exit history entirely. The drones don't crash dramatically. There's no explosion, no spiraling fall, no final burst of static. They simply stop responding, mid-flight, mid-signal, mid-air. One moment they are transmitting live footage, telemetry stable, batteries healthy, GPS locked. The next moment, the feed freezes, the controls go numb, and the machine becomes something else entirely, present but unreachable. Modern drones are designed to fail loudly, to return home automatically, to log every error, to preserve data even in catastrophic conditions. And yet, near certain suspected coordinates tied to the lost city of Z, they fail quietly, gracefully, as if receiving an instruction rather than encountering a problem. Operators describe the same sequence again and again. First, a slight lag. Controls feel delayed by a fraction of a second. Then, sensor disagreement. GPS reports one position, inertial sensors another. The drone hesitates, corrects, hesitates again, and then shutdown. Not battery depletion. Not signal loss alone. A full system halt, as if the machine decided continuing was no longer permitted. Recovery teams often expect to retrieve wreckage, but many drones are never found. Last known coordinates lead to empty clearings, or dense forest with no sign of impact. No broken branches, no scattered parts. It's as if the drone was never there. In other cases, drones are recovered intact, gently resting on the ground, powered off, data storage wiped clean. Not corrupted, wiped. Engineers examining these units find no evidence of electromagnetic pulses, no overheating, no component failure. The logs show normal operation right up until the moment they don't. No error codes, no warnings, just a clean end, like a sentence cut perfectly at the punctuation mark. What's disturbing is how selective this behavior is. Drones can fly for hours over surrounding regions without incident. The moment they cross into specific zones, often matching areas of buried megastructures, weather anomalies, or tribal warnings, the probability of failure spikes dramatically. Not gradually, abruptly. As if an invisible boundary has been crossed. Military-grade drones fare no better, hardened against interference, shielded against jamming, designed to operate in hostile electronic environments. They too experience unexplained shutdowns, sometimes even more decisively, as if their complexity makes them easier to disable, more surface area for something to interact with. There are cases where multiple drones fail simultaneously, launched from different locations, using different frequencies, different manufacturers, different control systems, all going dark within seconds of each other after converging on the same airspace. No known natural phenomenon behaves like that. The official explanations are always cautious. Magnetic anomalies, software bugs, rare atmospheric interference. But none of these explanations account for the precision, the consistency. The way failures respect boundaries that map uncannily well to ancient sites invisible from the ground. One drone operator described it as flying into a no-permission zone, not jammed, not attacked, denied, as if the airspace itself refused to cooperate. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Weather diverts, GPS drifts, radios fall silent, expeditions vanish, and now, autonomous machines, unburdened by fear, superstition, or fatigue, are being turned away just as effectively as humans were warned to be. Different era, same outcome. If the lost city of Z was hidden intentionally, drones would represent the one thing its creators could never have predicted directly. Eyes in the sky, persistent, tireless, capable of mapping everything. Unless the concealment was never about avoiding specific technology. Unless it was about controlling access itself. Some theorists suggest these zones may contain environmental conditions that interfere with electronics in subtle, layered ways. Ground composition affecting electromagnetic fields, underground structures acting as massive passive circuits, water channels amplifying interference, a landscape engineered not just to hide visually, but to disrupt observation at every level. Others go further. They point out that the shutdown behavior resembles command compliance more than failure, systems powering down in correct sequence, memory cleared before loss of power, motors locked safely. The kind of behavior seen when a device is told to stop, not when it is forced to. That idea makes people uncomfortable because it implies agency without visibility, control without presence, a system still running long after its builders are gone, or perhaps not gone at all. There is a phrase used quietly among some drone teams now. They call these areas dead air, not because nothing exists there, but because nothing is allowed to remain active. A silence imposed, not accidental, and silence is the most effective camouflage. A crashed drone invites investigation. A missing drone invites speculation. But a drone that simply ceases to exist in the data stream leaves nothing to chase, no footage to leak, no coordinates to revisit with confidence, just a gap where observation should be. If ancient builders wanted their cities to remain unseen, denying the sky would be the final step. Not with weapons, not with force, but with systems that make observation unreliable enough to discourage persistence. The drones don't report danger. They don't send warnings. They don't struggle. They obey. And in that obedience is a message far more unsettling than destruction. That whatever still governs those coordinates does not need to announce itself. It only needs to decide who gets to see and who doesn't. What unsettles people most is not the idea that the lost city of Z was destroyed. Ruins are comforting. Collapse fits our expectations. What truly disturbs is the alternative, that Z was never abandoned at all, that it didn't fall, didn't burn, didn't vanish into myth, that it simply stopped participating in the surface world. Because when you look at all the anomalies together, abandonment starts to feel like the wrong word. Cities decay when they are empty. Infrastructure fails. Systems break down. Yet, in the Amazon, patterns persist. Weather still bends. Signals still fail. Boundaries still enforce themselves. The land behaves less like a ruin and more like a maintained space. Quiet, yes. Invisible, yes. But active. Occupation doesn't have to mean crowds, noise, smoke rising from chimneys. Occupation can mean presence without display, continuity without expansion. A civilization that learned the cost of visibility might choose to exist in ways we no longer recognize as life. Imagine a society that reached its peak not by building upward, but inward. Underground halls instead of towers. Distributed systems instead of centralized capitals. Architecture designed to merge with ecosystems rather than dominate them. A population that learned to regulate climate, conceal heat, suppress electromagnetic noise, not to conquer the future, but to survive it. If such a society existed, abandonment would be unnecessary. Withdrawal would be enough. Tribal accounts never speak of cities left behind in ruins. They speak of places that are still there but not for us. They describe doors that no longer open, paths that no longer lead anywhere, agreements that expired for humans but not for the land. That language doesn't describe loss. It describes transition. Even Percy Fawcett's writings hint at this. He didn't describe shattered cities. He described spaces that felt paused, unfinished not because they were incomplete, but because their function continued elsewhere. Architecture waiting for occupants who were never meant to return to the surface. Modern technology keeps reinforcing this impression. Drones don't capture ruins. They are denied access. Satellites don't reveal bustling cities. They reveal deliberate absence. Genetic evidence doesn't show extinction. It shows removal. The kind of removal that leaves no descendants, because descendants were never meant to remain above ground. If Z is still occupied, then its occupants are not hiding from us out of fear. They are hiding out of indifference. We are not enemies. We are irrelevant. The surface world became unstable. Climate shifts, conflict, unpredictability, so they optimized for depth, silence, and time, and that reframes every warning. The invisible guardians are not monsters. They are maintenance protocols, environmental systems ensuring boundaries remain intact. The weather shifts are not defenses, they are stabilizers. The technological failures are not attacks, they are incompatibilities. Our machines don't break because they are harmed, they break because they don't belong. Occupation also explains restraint. If Z were empty, defenses would decay. Systems would fail randomly. Instead, they fail consistently. Cleanly, as if something still cares enough to keep things running properly, enough to prevent damage, enough to avoid escalation. A hidden city that is unoccupied would eventually be found. A hidden city that is still inhabited would never need to reveal itself. And perhaps that is the most unsettling idea of all, that somewhere beneath the Amazon, life continues in a form optimized for invisibility, not advanced in the way we define progress, not obsessed with expansion, just sustained, stable, enduring. They wouldn't watch us with curiosity. They would watch us the way we watch weather. Something external, something temporary, something to be waited out. If Z is still occupied, then the lost city was never lost. It was sealed. Not with walls, but with systems. Not with violence, but with patience. A civilization that understood the longest-lasting strategy is not domination, but disappearance. And if that's true, then every failed expedition, every malfunctioning drone, every warning from the tribes was never meant to scare us. It was meant to remind us. Some places are not ruins. Some cities don't die. They simply stop being part of our world.